What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If this video here on a Saturday gets to 1,000 likes, I will give one lucky commenter a cash prize. So make sure you make your presence felt in the comments and hit that like button. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit-down video. Also, make sure you check out our signature sit-down cigar available from Pavada Cigar Club. The link to buy is in the pinned comment of this video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting crime topic. And the Queens neighborhood of Howard Beach is a very desirable place to live. In fact, many people will tell you it's one of the nicest places to live as far as residential places to live in the greater New York area. It's close enough to the city, but not too close. It's near the water, and it has well-groomed lawns and good people that live in it. It's also a shadowy place that had many gangsters that lived in it over the years, including John Gotti and Joe Messino. One thing, though, about Howard Beach that we don't always talk about, though, is some of the racial components that have went into this neighborhood over the years. We have seen things that have went on in this area that have caused a lot of racial issues between both blacks and whites alike. We all know about the 1986 racial issue that went on in Howard Beach after there was an attack outside of a pizzeria called New Park Pizza. We have talked about that on this channel. In the early 2000s, though, another racial incident would happen, and it would feature a young Italian named Fat Nick Minucci, who, when we look into his history, there is a certain level of the mafia. We'll also get into what exactly happened with Nicholas Minucci and why it turned Howard Beach into yet another racial cauldron. The story of Fat Nick Minucci next on the Sit Down. Nicholas Minucci was born on June 4th, 1986, and came up in Queens, New York. He would grow up in the area of Lindenwood, not far from Howard Beach, and live on 78th Street. Now, as far as I know, and through certain sources that I have, it was said that Fat Nick Minucci, through his mother, was related to Gambino made man John Jackie Cavallo. Now, as far as I know, there is no known mob connection once Fat Nick got older with John Cavallo. However, there is a relation, as far as I know, through his family. Nick Minucci's childhood was quite nondescript and normal. It was said that he enjoyed hip-hop music and sports. Nicholas Minucci would go to middle school 226 in South Ozone Park, and he would ultimately attend John Adams High School in Ozone Park, though he would not get his high school degree. According to a classmate of Fat Nick Minucci, he would say that both middle school 226 as well as John Adams High School was where, quote, all the Crips were, and that when they were kids, it was very common in that neighborhood in the late 90s into the early 2000s to really love hip-hop. Nick Minucci loved 50 Cent. He wore the flat-brimmed hats. He wore the baggy clothes. He had the bling. And it was said that most of his friends were either Spanish or black, and that they were all very much into hip-hop. It was a normal thing. And we'll learn that down the road, Nick Minucci never had any sort of racial attitude as far as we know. The Nick Minucci seen here in a grainy photo where he is talking to police. Upon leaving high school, at one point, he would actually work at a bakery run by Peter Gotti, the son of John Gotti. Now, from what I understand, Peter Gotti set up Fat Nick with some sort of bread route. There's one thing we know about Peter Gotti is that he had always maintained some sort of bread truck, bread route, and a bakery in and around Howard Beach, Queens. Now, this is also said to be where Nicholas Minucci met the sons of Victoria Gotti, who was the daughter of John Gotti, Carmine, John, and Frank Agnello. And that down the road, we would see them palling around together. Fat Nick was seen in episodes of Growing Up Gotti, a show that would air in the early 2000s. So Fat Nick, living in Howard Beach, knew the Gottis. He knew people in that neighborhood. And I'm going to get in a little bit to some of the things that Fat Nick, according to the federal government, was involved in. According to the feds, during an investigation into Alphonse Trucchio, who was a Gambino capo, he would have an individual in his crew, an associate called Christopher Colon. According to the federal government, they would say that Fat Nick Minucci at one point was a loan shark debt collector and worked as an enforcer on behalf of Chris Colon on behalf of the Trucchio crew who operated out of Ozone Park, Queens. Now, this really didn't come out in the trial. However, the feds would discuss that this guy they knew about in some of their investigations of both Trucchio, Little Nick Carrazzo, and other people that were moving around in Queens. So, and as far as sources that I have as well, they would say that they knew that he was doing some sorts of work for both Chris Colon and or Alphonse Trucchio. Now, Fat Nick Minucci, though, would face some of his own legal issues before the incident that we're going to get into. In 2002, at the age of 17, Minucci would be involved in the stabbing of a person called John Rich. And John Rich at the time was 15 years old. Now, this incident would happen in the Broad Channel area of Queens. I guess from what I understand, it was some sort of argument between two sides, to which during the fracas, 15-year-old John Rich was stabbed, and Minucci was ultimately the doer. Minucci would ultimately be hit with a youthful offender status and wouldn't have to go to prison or face any juvenile facility. Now, what's weird about this case is in 2003, John Rich would mysteriously die after it was said that he fell into the path of an oncoming train in Queens. Now, the law enforcement would say that it was just John Rich was drinking with his friends and he stumbled into the track. But a lot of people wondered, this was kind of a mysterious thing. It was said, though, also that at one point, John Rich was going to be a witness against Nick Minucci. Now, I'm not saying anything happened. I'm not being a conspiracy theorist, but a lot of people did have their eyebrows raised a little bit when John Rich mysteriously died after being stabbed by Mr. Minucci. Now, Minucci would also, though, make his presence felt. He would be on Growing Up Gotti, as I said, and he was regularly close with the Gottis. Now, according to Vicky Gotti, she would tell the New York Post naturally that she didn't even know Nick Minucci and that the kids had only been around him one or two times and that they met him when he was working for Peter Gotti and that they really had no connection to him whatsoever. Now, this, though, would go against that thought, though, that in 2004, they would appear in a video for the song I'm a Hustler by Cassidy. Now, if you watch that video, you can see that in Philadelphia, in the video shoot, both Nick Minucci as well as the Gotti kids are all featured in the video. Now, it does seem odd that if they didn't know each other, they just miraculously happened to appear in Philadelphia together as extras in a music video. All the kids from Howard Beach, Queens just happened to stumble upon each other at the video shoot. So I think it's abundantly clear that the Gotti kids knew Nick Minucci, which doesn't matter here. It's just kind of interesting, all of the connections that they have. I want to, though, go to June 29th, 2005, because this is the incident that would change Mr. Minucci's life forever. Now, I'm going to read directly from the background law affidavit. Now, in the early morning hours of June 29th, 2005, at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, a longtime acquaintance of Nick Minucci would approach him as he drove his 2002 Cadillac Escalade in Howard Beach. Now, down the road, Minucci claims that this Escalade was not his. It belonged to a family member. Minucci was in the truck. He was driving. And in the passenger seat was a person called Anthony Ench. Now, it was said that Minucci and Ench were approached by a person called Francis Frank Agostini. Now, while driving, this individual would walk up to the truck and tell Ench and Minucci, quote, "some N-words trying to get at my chain." Agostini would also say, quote, "some N-words were scheming in the hood earlier, I saw." Now, Agostini would then get into the Cadillac Escalade, and Mr. Minucci and Mr. Ench and Mr. Agostini would begin looking for these individuals. This was their neighborhood, and it was very weird to see men kind of rooting around, trying to rob people and steal cars in the area. Now, we could ask ourselves, why was Minucci and these other two out at such a late hour? But that's not really an issue right now. They were in their neighborhood, and they had heard that people were scheming in the neighborhood, according to Agostini. Now, they would drive around and pass two black men who Agostini said were, quote, not the ones who had tried to rob him. But when that Minucci drove around the block, the two men had been joined by a third man, a person identified as Glenn Moore. Now, Glenn Moore would state on the record and to the police that they were in the area robbing vehicles and attempting to steal cars. They had tools on them, so they were in the area committing crimes. Make sure you understand that. These are not just innocent kids that were coming home from work like some of the other issues that have happened in this area over the years. Mr. Moore and his two assailants, Mr. Moore, also the other two individuals were called Richard Walker and Richard Pope. These individuals were in Howard Beach. They were not from Howard Beach, and they were there to steal vehicles. Now, the affidavit would state also that upon seeing the three individuals, one of them would yell out, quote, "where you N-words think you're going?" Now, Minucci would stop the vehicle and jump out with an aluminum softball bat in his hand. Now, the black men, Glenn Moore, Richard Pope, and Richard Walker, would take off running, and Minucci would chase after them, yelling additional racial epithets. He would throw the bat, which landed on the street. Minucci would then retrieve the bat, get back in his car, and give further chase. They would then corner Glenn Moore after he fell while trying to get away. Minucci would then punch and kick Moore on the ground. He would then strike Moore in the head multiple times with the bat and continue to allegedly yell racial slurs. Now, Anthony Ench, who was there with Minucci, would take Moore's sneakers and a bag he was carrying as they drove off in Minucci's car. The men would search the bag, and one of them would say that he liked Moore's Air Jordan sneakers and claimed them for himself. Now, the police would then arrive at the scene and begin interviewing Pope and Walker, and then the two men drove through the neighborhood and kind of tell them what happened. Minucci would be arrested the next day, and alongside Ench, their names and photos would be paraded around in the paper. Here, Ench can be seen being placed into a vehicle after he was arrested as well. So again, when we go back to what exactly went on here, these three are driving around. They see three blacks trying to rob vehicles. They don't want that going on in their neighborhood. Now, according to Minucci, he would say to multiple publications that he said the N-word regularly, but not the way that it's bad, according to him. He would say it in a more like hip-hop black way, and that he regularly called his friends that. It was just a normal way of talking for them, and that it was perceived as he was a racist. And he would go back to his past and discuss that, which this would be learned after people would go to his mother's home. All of his friends who were Spanish and black would come to the home. There were hip-hop magazines. He regularly went to video shoots for rappers. And his family would say that he can't be racist. He loves hip-hop culture. He's all about hip-hop culture. But it was painted, because we know Howard Beach is mostly white. We all see that the trial comes out. Al Sharpton starts showing up. He makes it into a big thing. And again, it was a black attacking or a white attacking a black. Now, it wasn't said that Glenn Moore was in the neighborhood robbing vehicles and attempting to steal cars. It was painted that Fat Nicholas Minucci was a racist and he was beating up black people because they were black, and that's why they were there, and it was a hate crime. So Nick Minucci had real issues. He also had to face the fact that this was going to be made into a very big thing. Now, ultimately, Glenn Moore in this incident would suffer 2 skull fractures and a brain bleed. And he would be in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks. And he would later tell the police that during the incident, Minucci continued to yell racial slurs at him. The issue for Minucci was one of the individuals involved in this who originally flagged the car down, Frank Agostini, who was the son of an NYPD detective, decided to flip against both Ench and Mr. Minucci. Now, there was a rumor at one point that Anthony Ench was also giving information. However, that ultimately didn't happen, supposedly, and he would plead guilty in this case. I want to make this clear as well. Fat Nick Minucci was the person who told the police who was also involved in this. So he doesn't get off scot-free as well in this. He also gave names. They all gave names in this. Fat Nicholas Minucci would have his day in court, and this became a very big story. It was a national story. The radio stations were talking about it. Opie and Anthony had a field day with this, who were 2 popular radio hosts back in the day. This was a big story. And it was, again, pitting whites against blacks, basically Italians against blacks. Sharpton showed up for the black cause, and for the white cause, it was friends of Mr. Minucci, people with free Fat Nick signs outside the court. And it turned into a bit of a haywire type of thing. Ultimately, Nicholas Minucci in 2006 would be found guilty of 1st and 2nd degree robbery in commission of a hate crime, as well as assault. He would be hit with 15 years in state prison. Now, Minucci would contend that during this, he never hit Mr. Moore in the face. He was only trying to subdue him through hitting him in the body, the legs, that kind of area. Now, Mr. Minucci's mother, Maria, would claim after the verdict that it was, quote, all corruption. Now, Minucci would say later in a Queens Chronicle interview that they would also not only try to paint him as racist, but he was a rich, spoiled kid, and that he drove a $60,000 car and he had a big piece of bling on his stomach. He would say that most of that money came from the fact that his grandmother died and she left him all sorts of money. But then they would also try to paint him as unemployed and where did he get the money? What's interesting is they never connected him to some of the mob stuff that he was supposed to be involved in, debt collection, things like that. But as I said, the feds did come out and say that at one point. For Nick Minucci, he would head off to prison and have to face the fact that he would miss most of his 20s due to the fact that he was in state prison. I will say one interesting thing about Minucci. He would say about his conviction, quote, I didn't get convicted. They convicted Howard Beach. They didn't convict Nick Minucci. They convicted Howard Beach. Because Howard Beach, if you ask anybody in Queens, is known as a racist neighborhood because of 1986. I have to say, I agree with Mr. Minucci. Look, did he commit a crime? Absolutely. He beat up a man who was in the area, committing crimes. We have to ask ourselves this. If you lived in a neighborhood and you saw anybody, regardless of skin color, robbing vehicles out in front of your home, what would you do? Some people would call the police. Some people would go and run out after them. We have seen racial issues all over New York over the years. Now, sometimes there are people that are racist and they're doing it strictly because the person is a different race or nationality. In this case, though, it's abundantly clear Mr. Minucci is not a racist. Okay. And we can see that going to video shoots for rappers and all this other stuff would make that clear. I mean, remember, This is a photo of Mr. Minucci right after the attack. Does he look like a racist to you? I guess I'll ask you. And Minucci, I think, got railroaded due to the fact that he lived in a neighborhood that, again, was white. It was perceived as racist, and it had racial issues over the years. Now, in this article for Queens Chronicle, Mr. Minucci would also be asked if he would ever apologize to Glenn Moore, to which Minucci would respond, quote, "I will not apologize to Glenn Moore. I apologize to his mother on the day of my sentencing because I knew that she suffered with all the media attention and embarrassment. I know it hurt her. I know what my mother went through. But to him, no." And I think Mr. Minucci felt he didn't do anything wrong here. Now, in the eyes of the law, he obviously did. Look, here's the truth, guys. If someone robs my home and I run out after them and shoot at them and hit them, I could go to jail for murder. Does it make it right? No. In the eyes of the law, it's illegal. And Mr. Minucci had, according to them, no reason to beat up Mr. Moore. It's a very slippery slope. Nick Minucci would ultimately get his GED in state prison and was released in April of 2018. He is currently 37 years old and lives somewhere on Long Island. I've reached out to Nick Minucci for comment. I've asked for an interview with him. I've not heard anything back. I'll let you know if I do. I would love to speak to Mr. Minucci and see what he's up to today. He's a grown man. He, again, is 37 years old, and he has moved on with his life. He gave a lot of time. He lost all of his 20s, and for good reason. He committed a crime, but did he do a hate crime? No. But as we've seen in New York over the years, a lot of the time, the people will come out and call things hate crimes. Again, some are. In this case, I don't think it was. What do you think? Let me know below. Was Nick Minucci guilty of a hate crime, or was he right? Howard Beach was convicted, not Nick Minucci. As I said, let me know what you think in the comments below. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.